So how is your week going, William?
So far, so good. Things are always busy, but I've managed to get a little break time, and the weather is good out here, so we're looking good so far. I hope that whatever is happening in your area is contained, but misses you and misses
Yeah,
anybody whose life may be in jeopardy at this point. Because, as I was sharing with you when you shared
yeah.
that with me, I had just recently heard about a guy who lost his house and his son is in intensive care from a direct hit from a tornado. And so I know those things are really tough. I remember years ago, I was driving across Elvis Presley, and that was back when I was working at MLG&W. And I had just driven across, and before I got home, the tornado had hit and torn up everything almost all the way down to Elvis Presley's house from
Oh,
like
wow.
Shelby Drive. And so it was a pretty eerie situation, but I had just missed it.
Yeah. Well, I remember 1999 when I walked out of the house that morning. I literally said, "Uh-oh," because of the way it felt.
Hmm.
It was the barometric pressure. Everywhere you looked, there were lowering clouds. And during the day, Jan and I would talk. It's going to be bad before the evening is out. And that's the day that a tornado that was 1 mile wide
Hmm.
and it stayed on the ground for 38 miles.
Wow.
And it went right straight through Moore, Oklahoma. Moore, Oklahoma, for some reason, is a funnel for tornadoes. If I
Mm.
was going to buy a house anywhere in Oklahoma, it would not be in Moore, Oklahoma. I mean, it's unbelievable the number of tornadoes that have hit that area. And we sat and watched that tornado on the ground, like I said, for 38 miles. And you could just see constant debris and the flashes of transformers. And you'd see cars and cows and everything just
Wow.
flying through the air. And it was just an unbelievable sight to behold. And I have never, to be really honest about it, I've never had an overt fear of tornadoes. I respect them to be sure, but that particular storm gave me a real profound respect for tornadoes. That was an F5, and they claim that the winds during that storm were the highest recorded winds in history. So it was really nasty. And, you just, as we sat and watched, and I won't take too much time on this, but as we sat and watched, a helicopter was in the air, a storm chaser, and they showed this line of cars that were over a mile long, backed up, trying to escape, and they were jammed up. They couldn't get anywhere. And they were talking about if that tornado hits this line of cars, it's going to be devastating. Strangely enough, you can call this God's providence, you can call it whatever you wish. It skipped right over that line of cars
Mm.
and then came right back down and just devastated the countryside.
Wow.
So, yeah, that was quite an evening to sit and to watch that on TV. And you just sit and cringe as you saw people's houses just completely disappear.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So,
really, really tough. I think there was one occasion where we might have been having a gospel meeting at the Memphis School of Preaching when I was a student there, and a tornado hit, and we were inside the building, and you could see the roof come up. You could actually see outside where it had lifted the roof,
wow.
but it didn't take it off. And it only lasts for a few minutes, but you could feel that impact and the wind. So yeah, those things are really,
Well, the
really.
same thing when I was in preacher school in Harrison, Arkansas.
Mhm.
They sounded the sirens, and this was a two-story building. And man, we all made a mad dash down to the basement.
Mm.
It was a really uh, big basement. And we got down there, and you could feel that whole building. The building was almost 90 years old, and you could feel that whole building just shake and shudder. And it took a whole lot of the roof off. Didn't destroy the building, thankfully, but we came up, and there were some trees. You couldn't hardly reach around them. They were that large, and they were just fallen over, they were twisted, they were destroyed. That was a really, really scary time. It really was. So now that we've given the weather report,
Yeah.
William, I wanted to touch on a little bit deeper, a little bit further on Romans chapter 4 and the Abrahamic promise, the Abrahamic inheritance, and the implications of what it meant when God told Abraham before he was ever circumcised, before there was ever a son, before there were ever 12 sons, before there were ever 12 tribes. The Lord told Abraham, and you and your seed, singular, that's the Messiah, shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Now, since he's talking about all nations of the earth being blessed before there were even any tribes of Israel, that is just prima facie demonstration that he wasn't talking about blessing just the seed of Abraham. Would you concur with that?
Yes, I would, and particularly in the context of Romans 4. He talks about the promise being made sure to all the seed, not only to that which was of the law, and then goes right back to refer to the text that you're talking about, the seed of Abraham.
Yeah, and then to go back to Romans chapter 4, let's start in where we've already covered this a little bit, folks, but I wanted to dig deeper into it this evening than what we have. And so in verse 7 and 8, Paul refers to David in Psalms 132. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Does this blessedness, now remember, this is said to David through David, does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. Well, how then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. We talked last week, William, a little bit about about how revolutionary and how shattering and stunning this statement would have been to any good faithful Jew in the first century. Where did the blessedness of Abraham come? Well, he was circumcised, uncircumcised. Why was it so shattering, earth shattering, for a Jew to hear that kind of thing?
Because to them, circumcision was everything. I mean, if you were not circumcised, you were cut out of the covenant. And of course, that's what God told Abraham in Genesis 17. So they would be considered as non-Jews from that perspective, outside of the covenant of Israel. And for him to say that would be including those that they just had a total repulsion for in terms of being associated with God and the promises.
Yeah, it seems to me like Paul is saying to his Jewish contemporaries, look what you guys have done to circumcision. You have used and are using at the current time, you are using circumcision as a means to exclude people. Well, it did exclude people to a certain extent because only those who were circumcised were in the covenant. That's correct, is it not?
Yes.
Okay. But the Jews were saying, because circumcision is for those in the covenant, and because it is the covenantal sign itself, then that must mean that there's no way for those outside this covenant to be blessed. But Paul seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul is saying you're overlooking the fact that while circumcision was indeed a sign of a covenant, no question about that, Abraham was blessed before ever and without being circumcised. That's what's revolutionary about it. That's what it seems to me that Paul is saying to broaden the scope of the blessings of Abraham. It was not to be on Israel only because, to reiterate, here is Abraham. Well, William, was Abraham a, quote, Jew?
No.
Loaded question there.
Not in that sense. Now, if you talk about by faith, you could reason that he would be, but in terms of his ethnicity, etc., no, he was not a Jew.
And he wasn't even an Israelite.
Correct.
So the very terms that people use today to speak of exclusion from the covenant, by that same means, it would have excluded Abraham. And that seems to me where Paul is heading with this. He is addressing people who were using circumcision as an exclusionary symbol. Only those who are circumcised are the seed of Abraham, is the way the Jews would argue at the time. And yet, once again, to reiterate, to drive this point home, Paul is saying, you're missing the point. Yes, circumcision is a covenantal sign. Abraham was blessed without it. So,
yeah, and
go ahead.
That's what's really unique about the argument that he makes, because, they would normally think, okay, God gave them circumcision through Abraham, but God didn't focus on that point. He focused on the fact that the promise was given to him prior to circumcision. And that's what made it so impactful and devastating to their paradigm.
Oh, absolutely. So, I've said this before on this program many, many times. Today, since we are so far removed from that culture, we're so far removed from the way of thinking of the ancient Jews in the ancient Near East, we fail to grasp how revolutionary so many of the biblical statements really are. And I have found this to be driven home to me the more I read Paul's dissertation here in Romans about the blessings of Abraham, how it came, who it came upon. And let's read just a little bit more. Romans 4:11. He received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised. Well, wait a minute. According to the Jews, you can't be righteous without the law. And Paul said, no, you got it all wrong. You're failing to see, you're failing to focus on justification by faith without the law, separate and apart from the law. Now, William, does this not go back to Romans chapter 3, 20 and 21, where Paul said that righteousness apart from the law is witnessed by the law and the prophets?
Yes, yes.
The law and the prophets foretold the time in which justification would come, not through the law, but through exactly how it came to Abraham.
Yes.
By faith. Now, the good Jew would therefore, it seems to me, would then automatically ask the question, are you telling us that circumcision is unimportant? Are you telling us that circumcision can just simply be dismissed as a child of Abraham? Is that what Paul's saying?
No, he's really not saying that. He's not denigrating circumcision, but he's letting them know that the promise that was going to come was not going to be rooted in circumcision. That doesn't mean that circumcision wasn't important or that it wasn't important particularly for the Jews at that time. It just indicates that the salvation that they all were to receive was not going to be rooted in circumcision.
Does this not raise the issue or the question of justification by the works of the law versus the works of faith, or justification by faith? Paul uses the term works of the law, 7 or 8 times in his epistles. And every single time he is saying that justification is not through the works of the law. Galatians 2, Galatians 3, Romans 7. So Paul is very clear that justification was not through the, quote, works of the law. Does that not, in this specific context, does this not identify circumcision as one of the works of the law by which a man could never be justified?
That's correct.
And
Absolutely correct.
does that not take us over here to Galatians chapter 5? Those of you who seek to be justified by circumcision, you are fallen from grace. If any man seeks to be justified by circumcision, Christ shall profit him nothing. Well, what's Paul talking about? The works of the law. And he is focusing very specifically on circumcision. You know, William, some years ago, I don't even remember how many years ago it was, but it's several years ago, I had a debate with a Torah observant young man right there in Memphis. And I asked him, is circumcision necessary? And he said, yes. So here is and in America, you know this, there's a pretty strong Torah observant movement. And they will tell you right up front, yes, physical circumcision is a mandate from God. Now, I've had some of them tell me, well, it's not to be justified, but you have to do it to be saved. Okay, wait a minute. It's not to be justified, it's just to be saved. Wow. Yeah, that doesn't work.
No.
But does that not put us right back into this dilemma of Paul's justification by works of the law versus justification by faith? And does that not say extremely powerfully that circumcision was a work of the law that the Jews thought, and appealed to Scripture for? Unless you're circumcised and keep the law, you cannot be saved.
Yes, they most certainly said that. And it, again, just showed how their faith was in the works of the law. Circumcision, was a part of that. That is circumcision in the flesh. And they sought to not only practice it, but impose it on anyone who desired salvation, as you were indicating from Acts chapter 15.
Yeah, and that raises the issue, exactly how would a person define, perhaps in its fullness, the works of the law? We know it involves circumcision because that's what Paul's discussing right here. How is a person justified? Is it through law or is it through grace and faith? Well, it's not through the law, i.e., circumcision. So it's not of the works of the law being circumcised. But the Judaizers were taking that and building on it and saying, except a man be circumcised and keep the law of Moses, he cannot be saved. Well, does that not put observance of the law of Moses squarely into that realm of the works of the law?
Oh, yes, most definitely.
And could we not then extrapolate from that to the book of Colossians, where Judaizers were a major, major problem? They were going to the Gentiles that had been converted, they had been baptized, and they were saying, you have to be circumcised in the flesh. You have to be circumcised. And not only that, you have to keep the feast days. Nothing was more vital, nothing more integral to keeping the law of Moses than observing the feast days. Would you agree with that assessment?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, most definitely. They would impose, the observance of these feast days on them as well. A text that I thought about when you said that, you went to Colossians, my mind went to Galatians 3, where you have this contrast between, and actually uses the terminology, the works of the law versus the hearing of faith. I'll read that, as we return back to Colossians and talk about the feast days. And then later on in this context, he goes back to feast days in chapter 4, actually.
Yep.
So it's still the same thing in both of these contexts. But when he speaks to them, he says to them in verse 5, therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? So there again is the contrast between the hearing of faith, which refers, of course, to the gospel, and the fact that the gifts were given to those who obeyed the gospel, just like Mark 16 says, those who believe, these signs shall follow those who believe. And yet they were not given to those who were observing the law. And that was one of the distinguishing characteristics between the children of the law, or those who follow the law, the children of the flesh, versus the children of the spirit. And encouched in that was the keeping of these feast days as well, that you're speaking of in Colossians chapter 2.
Yeah, to me, Colossians chapter 2, and years and years ago, I wrote a track on baptism and new appreciation. I don't know if you remember that or not.
Yes, I do.
But when I came to Colossians chapter 2:11 and following, where Paul says, "You were circumcised," it hit me one day. And of course, I've been reading the commentaries and what have you, and the commentators were pointing out Paul is responding to the Judaizers who are saying, "Oh, yeah, you're a Christian. That's great. You're a follower of Jesus, the Messiah. That's great. That's wonderful. Guess what? You got to be circumcised." And William, I'm convinced personally. Now, you tell me if I'm way out in left field here. I am personally convinced that the Judaizers felt like they had perfect scriptural authority for imposing physical circumcision on anyone coming into Christ. And I believe that Isaiah chapter 52 is one of the texts that they would have used. Now, I haven't been able to find in any of my reading anywhere any record of this being used this way by the Judaizers. I'm simply, and I want this, I want everybody to understand, I'm speculating here, but the reason I make this argument is because of Isaiah 52. Now, Isaiah 52 is a prophecy of the restoration of Israel. It's the time of the remarriage of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, then being restored to the 2 southern tribes, and then the Gentiles being brought in. But notice this: awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion, put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. Now watch this: for the uncircumcised and the unclean shall no longer come to you. Shake yourself from the dust. Arise, sit down, O Jerusalem. That's resurrection. That's just pure and simple. Shake yourself from the dust. That's resurrection language. But my point here is, here's the prediction of the New Jerusalem. Here's a prediction of the new creation. So here come the apostles preaching the new creation. And those who accept Christ as the Messiah are accepting that. And they're being baptized into Christ. And the Judaizers are saying, "Oh, that's all fine and good. Well, we're thrilled that you have become a member of the community of the Gnostic body of Christ here. But look what Isaiah said. When the new creation came, when Israel was restored, no uncircumcised would enter." So guess what? We acknowledge you've been baptized into Christ. We acknowledge that, but you got to be circumcised. So Paul, the rhetoric of Colossians chapter 2:11 and following, Paul is saying, guys, you have been circumcised with the circumcision not made with hands, and putting off the body of flesh. And so this rhetorical interchange, if I can use that, between Paul and the Judaizers shows that he is interacting with people who are appealing to what? Justification by the works of the law. And chief among that is circumcision. And Paul says, no. I'm not having any of that. I'm not having anyone impose physical circumcision, i.e. works of the law. Not only that, in verses 14 and following, what does he do? Well, verse 16 and 17, therefore let no man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are a shadow of the good things that are about to come. He is following up on his discussion of and his rejection of justification by works of the law by saying, don't let anybody force you into keeping the feast days. Now, they were, to be sure, still a shadow of the good things that were about to come, but that meant they were about to pass away. Am I tracking there on what you're seeing there in the text? And by the way, and I wrote a little book on this, on Minds Misplaced, an exegesis of Colossians chapter 3 and dispensationalism. Uh, it really, really stunned me when I began to examine Colossians 2 and 3 in light of the Judaizing tendency when Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, if then you be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, not on things on the earth. You died, your life is hidden in Christ. And it hit me one day. It's like, wait a minute. I know there's a chapter division here, but that doesn't mean anything. He's still talking about the elements of the world that was passing away, Colossians 2:20.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's saying, do not put your affection on things on the earth, Greek word gi, as you know. And it hit me, it seems to me that the word gi here would better be translated as land. And he's still talking to those being pressured by the Judaizers to keep the law of Moses, which would include circumcision, pilgrimages to Jerusalem, i.e., the land, and observance of the feast days. In other words, all of which were works of the law. And so he says, don't put your affection on things on the land. The new moon's feast days and the Sabbath, circumcision, the temple, the priesthood. Don't put your affection on any of that. Set your affection on things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of the majesty on high. To me, that was a really, really stunning insight. And what I started to say, I started grabbing commentaries off my shelves here. I could not find a single commentary who wanted to translate gi as land and Colossians 3 as a continuance of his discussion against the Judaizers. Not one. Linsky, as a matter of fact, went so far as to say Colossians 3, 1-3 has nothing whatsoever to do with Paul's previous discussion against the Judaizers. Totally new subject. And so, go ahead.
I was just going to say that makes it really tragic because they know what the nature of the dying and rising is in chapter 2. And when they get to chapter 3, where, of course, this unfortunate chapter division is in terms of, subject matter, they fail to see that, he's still dealing with that same dying and rising motif in this context and showing, and that's also interesting too for people who want to look at the, look at salvation as just a one-off, in that moment thing, as opposed to being this process that was being carried out, which is what Colossians 3 demonstrates all the way, into the next few verses that are listed there. So this is very, very important, and it shows that the nature of it doesn't change. And people readily give up the nature when you're in Colossians 2. They readily do that.
Oh, absolutely.
They want to switch to a whole different paradigm in chapter 3 in terms of what the actual fulfillment is and what the consummation of that process is, because they disconnect them.
Well, and another classic example of that is 2 Timothy chapter 2, 10-12. This is a faithful saying, worthy of all acceptation, that Jesus Christ died to save sinners, and we believe that if we died with him, we shall also live with him. And so right there in mid-verse, William, commentators do exactly what you're saying. Oh, the death there. No, that's not physical death. I think it's pretty obvious. Paul's not talking about to a bunch of dead people, physically dead people. And yet he's saying if we die, that's in the aorist tense, aorist active, if I'm not mistaken. And he said, so if we died with him, we believe we shall also live with him. Where does Paul change his hermeneutic?
Yeah, we would have to imply two deaths.
Oh, yeah.
in that scenario, if you want to go with the death that's different, or rising and living, that's different from the dying there. The dying that he said they died with them. Now, where can you find anywhere in that text where they died physically with Christ? And the death that they died with him, according to Romans 6, is the death that he died no more. So why isn't, and this was the point that Max raised when he was dealing with this promise of Abraham. Why is it that they can't receive in the death that they died with Christ what he received from it? And that was the dying no more. Yet here we are, we said we've died with Christ, and yet we die a lot more. We die some more. We don't stop dying because they turn it into a physical dying.
And in Romans chapter 6, they turn it into a physical living.
Yes.
If we have been planted with him in the likeness of his death, and everyone accepts that's a metaphoric type of thing, symbolized by being buried with Christ in baptism, they understand it's not physically dying with Christ. Okay, so as a matter of fact, I appealed to this in Romans chapter 6 in my debate with Chris Date, and Chris Date said, "Well, are you saying that Paul was talking about them dying metaphorically with Christ, spiritually with Christ?" I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Are you actually saying that?" I said, "Yes."
The Bible does.
Why not? That's what Paul says. But then again, just like 2 Timothy, just like Colossians 3, just like Ephesians chapter 2, Paul says, if then we were buried with him by baptism in his death, that like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death. Well, to reiterate, not to be facetious, but to reiterate, nobody died with Christ biologically in baptism. Not on purpose, anyway.
Well, look at the verses that follow right here in Colossians 3. For you died, and your life is hidden.
It's hidden
with Christ in God.
Yeah.
And so, how were the Colossians dead with Paul writing to them? I mean, he sent them a letter. How many people write letters to people in the graveyard, right? Just doesn't happen. He wrote them a letter and said that they had died. The only thing in the context that shows where they had died was in chapter 2. And then he says their lives were hidden. So again, he couldn't be talking about anything physical in terms of the life that he was speaking of, but that life was hidden in Christ. And he says, but when Christ, who is our life, appears, then shall you appear. Well, that can't be a physical appearing either from that perspective. And so many people want to, put those concepts on the resurrection, but that is in fact what he's dealing with is resurrection in terms of the concept here. But the concept of being hidden has to correspond in nature and kind to the appearing. It's
right.
Not a physical being hidden, and it's not a physical appearing. It is a manifestation, right. But it's a manifestation that is done where you are using something in the physical realm. I'd say the fall of the temple, from my point of view.
Oh, absolutely.
That manifests that. And that would demonstrate both the appearing of Christ, which was not physically visible, and the appearing of the believers with him.
Yeah, and I think this is verified in Colossians chapter 3. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then we shall also appear with him in glory.
Glory, yes.
We have this concept of shame versus glory found in all of these contexts that we have mentioned here. They had died with him, past tense, by joining with him in his suffering. Well, how had they joined with him in his suffering? Obviously not physically, as we already pointed out, but to join with Christ, who had been crucified, to be joined with his suffering was to experience his shame. It is to join with him in what Paul calls repeatedly, what Peter calls repeatedly, the sufferings of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I've tried to say many, many times, in the ancient Near East, and it's still present today, by the way, but in the ancient Near East, there was this incredible social construct, to use that term. Philosophical belief might be a good way to put it. If you had a fatal disease, terminal disease, number one, you were already considered dead. You would be called dead.
Yes.
But if somehow you recovered, you had been raised from the dead.
Correct.
And while you had that disease, and leprosy is a prime example of this. The ancient literature is full of this. To have leprosy was just to be the very expression and the very epitome of shame. But guess what? Those who were touched by Jesus, those who were healed by Jesus, and we're told about Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. When he was baptized by the prophet, he came up out of the water, and his skin was like that of a child. Now that's that's really remarkable. He had gone from being, and look, he is a mighty man, but he's still an object of shame because he has leprosy. As a leper, no one can get close, real close to him. And by the way, which makes a very, very powerful statement of the fact that the prophet baptized him. The prophet immersed him. That speaks eloquently of the nature of the faith of the prophet, does it not? So anyway, this radical change from leprosy to having skin like a child goes from shame to glory. If you were a person that had been extremely wealthy and you lost your wealth through fortunes of war or whatever it might be, that was considered shame. Didn't matter if it was your fault or not. I mean, the shame was exacerbated if you were a gambler or if you spent it on profligate living or whatever. Yeah, the shame was exacerbated. But no matter how you lost it, that was an object of shame. If somehow you got wealthy again, your fortune was reversed. You're now wealthy again. You've been raised from the dead. That's just the way they thought. And so
Same
here,
thing with barren wombs, etc. If the woman was barren, like in the case of Sarah, and even with Abraham,
absolutely,
they were considered as good as dead.
Yes, absolutely. And again, that's a concept we have a tough time wrapping our heads around because that's not our culture. I do remember when I was a child, I would do something maybe I wasn't supposed to, and mom would go, "Shame on you. Shame on you." Well, where's that concept in our modern world? Do we teach our kids a sense of shame over actions that are not appropriate, language that's not appropriate? Very quick anecdote. Just this last week, I was watching some YouTube videos. I was looking for some particular videos on some debates, and I ran onto a video. This guy was on the Joe Rogan show, and I don't watch Joe Rogan very often at all because the language is so coarse, generally speaking. But this guy was telling about spending time with a tribe in Africa and the things that they ate and did, and every sentence had GD in it, had the F-bomb in it. And finally, in the comment section, I just put shame, shame, shame. Can you not talk like a civilized, mature individual? I don't know if they removed it or not, but I just got so sick of listening to it. So I posted my comment and I just left. But anyway, in all of these passages that we have spoken of here this evening, folks, and remember, this is Abrahamic, and it's related to resurrection. I want you to think about this, folks, and I want William to comment on it. Abraham was living in the land of the Amorites, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You're supposed to help me out here. Okay.
All right.
Matter of fact, Ezekiel says that the father of the Israelites was an Amorite. That's where he came from. That was his land. Well, who were the Amorites in the eyes of the Israelites historically, a people of gross, gross immorality and cruelty. They were a shameful people. That's the land from which Abraham came, pardon me, into a land that God showed him. He went from a land of death, sin, and death to a land given to him by God. He was resurrected by faith. Am I tracking here, William?
Oh yes, yeah. That's another very very important concept, because even inheritance is spoken of from the perspective of inheriting the land, and so when you come out of a land that might be typified as relating to sin, or even literally in the case of Abraham, into a new land, that would constitute resurrection. And even with Israel in their national resurrection concepts, when they were carried off into captivity,
They were
that
dead.
was in a state of death. And when they were released from captivity and given their liberty, then that was resurrection.
Yeah. And once again, let me reiterate, these are concepts that we're not very familiar with today, but in order to understand the biblical language and the biblical books, we need to be understanding all of this. So here's the first century church. Paul is writing to them about the Abrahamic promise, talking about Abraham leaving his home, going to a land that the Father would show him. That's Hebrews 11, obviously, but it lies behind Romans chapter 4. And then he's going to tell us about Abraham, whose faith was such that he was convinced that God could bring and deliver Isaac to him from the dead. Again, that's Hebrews 11, but it lies behind Romans chapter 4 as well. And then he speaks about the deadness of Abraham's body being old and the deadness of Sarah's womb because she was old. And what did God do? Brought life from that deadness. And so all throughout Paul's terminology and all throughout Paul's even theology, he has this theology of death and life, of shame versus glory. And he carries that right through into Romans chapter 6, as we've already said. As he talks about them in Romans chapter 6, he says, God be thanked that you were the servants of sin. Well, what does that mean? That's shame. But you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered to you, being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. And not only that, he even goes so far as to say, he said, when you were the slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. Now look at verse 21. What fruit did you have in those things whereof you are now ashamed? The things that they once participated in before becoming Christians was a life of shame and was now being viewed in that proper light now that they have come into Christ. And he says, the end of those things is death. Well, why would he say that? Well, Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. It's not biological death, not biological, annihilation. It is alienation from God. So to reiterate
That's
here,
kind of Edenic motif as
oh,
well.
oh yeah,
When you talk about eating the fruit that leads to death, and then the eating of the tree of life, which brings about resurrection from death. So that's the concepts that are being referred to here.
yeah. And I was just reading through this week, and I've seen these motifs, the Edenic motifs here many
Mhm.
times, but I just refreshed my mind on it. It's like, okay, you've got the garden, you got the eating of the forbidden fruit, and the end thereof was shame and
Yes,
death,
yes.
or shame as death, death as shame, if you want to put it that way. And the end thereof it was death. And now Paul is saying, just like Adam, because in Romans chapter 5, guess what he does? Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, therefore death passed upon all men because all men sin. He is saying everybody follows in the path of Adam. What was the path of Adam? Eating the fruit, being ashamed, dying. Same identical pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here's Paul saying, he's saying all of this to living, breathing human beings who had died in sin, died because of sin, but now in Christ, by being baptized into Christ, they have died to sin. As the text that you cited a few moments ago, Romans chapter 6, 9 to 11, in that he, that is Christ, died, he died unto sin, therefore never to die again, to paraphrase. Likewise, therefore, count yourselves likewise to be dead to sin. Well, we don't have to die biologically to die to sin. That's his whole point in Romans 6.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's why he goes ahead to say, thanks be to God that you were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine, which was delivered you, being then made free from sin. He's using, to be sure, he is using the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, which was clearly physical, but it had a spiritual element to it that Paul is emphasizing. And people, and I'm not, believe you me, I'm not devaluing the physical by any stretch of the imagination. I'm looking at what Paul is emphasizing, in that he died to sin. That's a spiritual reality. And as we talked, I think it was last week, people get so hung up on the physicality of the entire story of redemption. They almost fail. Sometimes they almost refuse to lift up their eyes to the spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, let me read a quote to you. This is from J. Christian Becker, very, very noted scholar. And he's talking about suffering and hope. It's really it's not the easiest reading book in all the world, but it's very, very insightful about how people historically deal with suffering. And I don't always agree with everything that he says, but nonetheless, he's got some very insightful things. But he talks about the significance. Now, I'm pretty sure he wasn't intending to be giving aid to the preterist movement. I'm real sure of that. But what he says is so relevant to what we're talking about tonight, about the spiritual realities lying behind Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the spiritual realities lying behind the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. The importance of the physical pointing to the spiritual is what I want to get to. This is on page 70, again, the book Suffering and Hope by J. Christian Becker. The socio-economic and political crisis of the churches in Asia Minor under Emperor Domitian. Obviously, I disagree with that. I think, that's not even accurate. But nonetheless, that's his position. Has become so critical in comparison with the situation of 1 Peter that Revelation drowns Christian hope, as it were, in a sea of rich poetic images. Images of hope represent here an anti-world, the world of God's reality, which is the antithesis of the world of daily experience, and which comes to expression in exceedingly hostile language. Now, I would like everybody to pay attention to that. What he's saying here is that God doesn't view the physical realities of the world in the same way that human beings do. Human beings see just the physical. God sees something else. So let me continue. Therefore, hope is framed by a world of antithetical absolutes represented by such mythopoetic symbols as Babylon and Zion and the dragon and the woman in chapters 13 and 14. Okay, now pay very careful attention to what he says next. In typical apocalyptic fashion, this worldly events become transparent to their transcendent causes. In other words, The physical points to the spiritual. The physical points to the transcendent. Although the battle between good and evil is waged on earth, nevertheless, it is essentially a reflection of a heavenly battle between God and Satan. The conflicts of this world, such as the worlds of emperors, governors, priests, and persecutors, are actually reflections of heavenly dramas. Therefore, Christian hope can be sure of God's victory on earth because God's power has already won the conflict in heaven. What he is saying here is, what you see is not what you get. The world sees the defeat of Christianity. God sees the victory of Christianity.
Yeah, and it's like the war mentioned in Ephesians 6.
Ephesians chapter 6.
Yeah.
And it's when I read that, I wrote out in the margin, Matthew chapter 24, verse 30. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars of heaven shall fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and they will see the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens. Well, as many commentators, scholars have taken note, what Jesus is saying here is not, as Eusebius applied the vision of Constantine, something up in the sky. Eusebius said, oh, that's what this is talking about. No. The force of the Greek is in the visible events of the judgment on Jerusalem. They would perceive, i.e., see, that Christ was enthroned in the heavens and coming as the Father had come on the clouds of heaven. Never physically, never visibly, never bodily. Yahweh was always enthroned in the heavens every time he used the Assyrians to judge anyone, or the Babylonians, or whoever. He was always enthroned in the heaven. But he was said to be seen coming on the clouds of heaven.
Yeah, and go ahead. No, I was just going to say, when you say not physically, etc., sometimes we have to be careful when we say bodily, because when you look at it from a covenantal standpoint of view, it is bodily in that sense, and but not in a physical 5 feet. How many inches you given? 5.5 or something like that.
5'5" Jewish man. Yeah.
So that's important to recognize as well. But that whole point is, it's not physical in that sense. It's the physical, as you were saying, that manifests his coming, his covenantal coming, his bodily coming from that perspective.
Yeah, and Paul would express that in 2 Timothy chapter 1, where he says that God saved us, not according to the works which we have done, but according to the working of his own grace through Christ, which was given to us in Christ Jesus, rather, who was manifested, phanerao. You know, well, he says that Christ was manifested, and his appearing, epiphany.
Yes.
Well, Christ didn't shine forth, and that's what epiphany means, to shine forth. But when you look at what Isaiah says about the first coming of Christ, it would be a coming in humility, not in brightness and shining and what have you. And yet here's Paul using the incarnation of Christ. He's just defining it as the epiphany and the phanerao. So Paul's not looking on the physically optical incarnation of Christ as the shining forth. He was saying that it was the works of Christ that made manifest who he was. His works were the sign of who he was and is. And like I said, that to me, that gets back to what, if I'm understanding J. Christian Becker well, he is saying that when men look at things a certain way, and I like Colossians chapter 2, 11 and 12 on this. In Colossians chapter 2, I'm sorry, it's verse 14 and 15. And it says that Christ triumphed over the principalities and the powers in the cross. Oh, wait a minute. What did the world see as Jesus hung on the cross?
They saw nothing but defeat.
They saw nothing but defeat. They saw shame. They saw ignominy. They saw
Humiliation, yeah.
humiliation. That's what they saw from the perspective of God, the Father. They saw victory. They saw glory. And of course, that was epiphanied in the resurrection. There was the shining forth. That for sure was the manifestation of
Yeah.
Christ's glory. Go
And
ahead.
the second part of this, it says that having disarmed the principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle
Oh, yeah.
of them, triumphing over them in it. And yet you don't see him leading a procession of all the enemies that he defeated like they did in the natural realm when they
Right.
defeated them and led them into the, the city, naked and bare, etc. But yet it says that this is what Christ did. He made a public spectacle of them. So through the cross and his death and resurrection, we have to see that that victory is accomplished over all those principalities and powers.
Yeah, I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says God has chosen the foolish things of this world to confound those who are wise. The world wants to see that massive spectacle. The world wants to see the parade. What we see is an empty tomb.
Mm-hmm.
And the victory of Christ, and therefore our victory through that empty tomb. So it's all in perspective. And all of this is directly related, folks, all the way back to Abraham leaving that land of death, coming to life in the new land, so to speak. And that salvation which he achieved through righteousness, which he achieved through faith, was not through his own personal goodness or the works of the law, separate and independent from the works of the law. And thus Paul would go ahead to conclude in Romans chapter 4, the blessing of Abraham comes not only on those of the seed who are under the law, but those who are the seed of Abraham by faith. Two ways of being a child of Abraham, right? Number one, naturally. Number two, spiritually. And the spiritual seed of Abraham becomes the inheritors of the promises and the blessings of Abraham. Okay?
That's it.
All right. William, great to be with you again this evening. Thank you. And I was glad that I got to stay through the whole program. And I heard things a couple of different times that made me turn around and go, whoops. But, folks, thank you so much for joining us here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
All right. Good night, everyone.